I was fumbling with my apartment access card again, the magnetic strip catching against the worn fabric of my jacket pocket as I tried to extract it without dropping the stack of mail balanced precariously in my other arm. The card had been acting up for weeks. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and I'd been meaning to request a replacement from the building management. But like most things in my life, I kept putting it off, hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. The elevator doors stood open, waiting, and I could hear the mechanical hum that preceded their inevitable closing. I yanked the card free with more force than necessary, sending 3 pieces of mail fluttering to the polished lobby floor like autumn leaves. Bills, probably. They always were. I stood there for a moment, staring down at the scattered envelopes, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over my shoulders like an old coat I couldn't quite shake off. 34 years old, and this was my life. Coming home to an empty apartment every evening, juggling mail and access cards like some kind of poorly coordinated circus act. The elevator doors began their slow, inevitable slide toward each other, and I bent to gather the fallen letters, my movements clumsy with fatigue and something deeper, a bone-deep loneliness that I'd grown so accustomed to that I barely noticed it anymore, like the persistent hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic outside my bedroom window. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. "Hold the elevator!" I straightened up, clutching the retrieved mail against my chest, and instinctively reached out to stop the doors. They bounced back open with a soft pneumatic sigh, revealing the elevator's dim interior. The footsteps grew closer, and I found myself face to face with someone I'd never seen before. A man who looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with gentle eyes and graying hair at his temples. He was carrying a small potted plant, something green and leafy that looked entirely out of place in the sterile lobby of our building. "Thank you," he said, slightly breathless, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. A softness, maybe, or a kind of weariness that I recognized because I carried it myself. I'm still getting used to the timing of these doors. We stepped into the elevator together, and I found myself acutely aware of the small space we now shared. The air seemed charged with the awkwardness of 2 strangers forced into proximity, but there was something else there too, a kind of mutual recognition, as if we were both members of some unspoken club of people who moved through the world quietly, without making much of an impression. "Which floor?" I asked, my finger hovering over the button panel. My voice sounded rusty, like I hadn't used it in days. Which, come to think of it, might have been true. My work involved mostly emails and the occasional phone call, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd had what you might call a real conversation with another human being. 7, he said, adjusting his grip on the plant. "You?" "Same." The word hung between us in the small space, loaded with a significance I couldn't quite name. Same floor, same building. How long had he been living here? How long had we been passing like ships in the night, 2 solitary figures navigating the same hallways without ever really seeing each other? The elevator began its slow ascent, and I found myself stealing glances at him in the distorted reflection of the polished metal doors. He had strong hands, I noticed, with long fingers that held the plant with surprising gentleness. There was a small scar on his left knuckle, barely visible, and I found myself wondering about its origin. A childhood accident? A moment of carelessness in the kitchen? The kind of small injury that everyone accumulates over the years, each one a tiny story written on the body. "I don't think we've met," he said after a moment, turning to look at me directly. "I'm David. I moved in about 3 weeks ago." "Michael," I replied, extending my hand automatically. When our fingers touched, I felt a small jolt of warmth that surprised me. His grip was firm but not overwhelming, and for just a moment, the contact felt like something I'd been missing without realizing it. "Nice to meet you, Michael." He held my gaze for a beat longer than strictly necessary, and I felt something shift in the air between us. I have to say, it's refreshing to meet someone else who appreciates the art of elevator timing. I found myself almost smiling at that. Well, I wouldn't call my performance tonight particularly artistic. More like barely functional. Trust me, you're doing better than most people in this building. Yesterday, I watched someone let the doors close on an elderly woman with a walker rather than hit the door open button. There was something in his tone, not quite bitterness, but a kind of resigned disappointment that I recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone who had expected better from the world and been let down just often enough to lower his expectations, but not quite enough to stop caring entirely. The elevator chimed softly as we reached the 7th floor, and the doors slid open to reveal the familiar hallway with its neutral carpet and harsh fluorescent lighting that always made everyone look slightly ill. We stepped out together, and I realized with a strange mixture of relief and disappointment that our brief encounter was coming to an end. "Well," David said, shifting the plant in his arms, "I guess this is where we part ways." "Which apartment?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why. Curiosity, maybe, or just a reluctance to let this small moment of human connection dissolve back into the anonymous silence that usually defined my evenings. 7G, he said. End of the hall. I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. I'm in 7F. We're neighbors. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or a kind of pleased recognition. Well, that explains why I keep hearing someone moving around at all hours of the night. I was starting to wonder if the building was haunted. Heat crept up my neck. Sorry about that. I'm a bit of an insomniac. I try to keep quiet, but... No, he said quickly, holding up one hand. I didn't mean it as a complaint. Actually, it's been kind of comforting. It's nice to know there's someone else awake when the rest of the world seems to be sleeping. There was something achingly honest in his admission, and I felt a recognition so sharp it was almost painful. How many nights had I lain awake, listening to the building's small sounds and wondering who else might be staring at their ceiling, wrestling with thoughts they couldn't quite put to rest. We walked down the hallway together, our footsteps muffled by the carpet. The distance to our respective doors seemed both too short and impossibly long. I found myself walking more slowly than usual, trying to stretch out these few additional moments of companionship. The plant, I said, nodding toward the green thing in his arms. New addition to the apartment? David glanced down at it, and something soft crossed his features. My sister gave it to me when I moved in. She said every home needs something alive in it. He paused, then added with a self-deprecating laugh, I'm hoping I can keep it that way. I don't have the best track record with living things. There was something vulnerable in that admission, a small window into whatever circumstances had brought him to this building, to this moment. I wanted to ask more, to understand the story behind those words, but we'd reached my door, and the moment felt too fragile to push. I turned to face him, and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. In the harsh hallway lighting, his eyes looked darker, more shadowed, but there was something gentle there too. Something that made me want to keep talking, to find a reason not to disappear behind my door and back into the solitude that had become my default state. Well, I said, fishing my keys out of my pocket. I guess I'll see you around. I guess you will. He paused, then seemed to come to some kind of decision. Actually, I was wondering... I've been meaning to ask someone about the neighborhood. Good places to get coffee, that sort of thing. I don't suppose you'd have any recommendations. It was such a simple question, but something in the way he asked it made me think it wasn't really about coffee at all. It was about connection, about finding a foothold in a new place, about the basic human need to feel like you belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was just a conversation with a neighbor in a fluorescent-lit hallway. There's a place called Luna's about 3 blocks south, I heard myself say. They roast their own beans. It's pretty good. Luna's, he repeated, as if committing it to memory. I'll have to check it out. Another pause, longer this time. I could feel the conversation reaching its natural endpoint, but neither of us seemed quite ready to let it go. There was something hanging in the air between us, unspoken but palpable. A recognition, maybe, or just the rare pleasure of talking to someone who seemed to understand the particular weight of moving through the world alone. "David," I said, surprising myself with my own boldness, "if you ever need anything, moving boxes or directions or just—" I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence without sounding desperate or strange. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was so genuinely warm that it made something tight in my chest loosen just a little. "That's very kind. And the same goes for you, of course, if you ever need anything at all." We stood there for another moment, two men in a hallway, holding on to a conversation that had run its course but somehow didn't want to end. I could hear the distant sound of a television from one of the other apartments, the low murmur of voices and laugh track that spoke of other people's lives, other people's connections. Finally, David took a small step backward toward his own door. "Well, Michael from 7F, it was genuinely nice to meet you." "You too, David from 7G. He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. For just a moment, he looked younger, less weighted down by whatever burdens he carried. Then he turned toward his door, and I watched as he juggled the plant and his keys, going through the same small ritual of arrival that I performed every day. I let myself into my own apartment, but instead of the relief I usually felt upon closing the door behind me, I felt something else. A strange sense of anticipation, maybe, or just the echo of human warmth in a space that had grown too accustomed to silence. My apartment welcomed me with its familiar emptiness. The living room with its single chair positioned to face the television, the kitchen with its clean counters and minimal signs of actual use, the bedroom where I spent too many hours staring at the ceiling. It was clean, organized, functional, and utterly devoid of the kind of life that David's sister had been talking about when she gave him that plant. I set the mail on the kitchen counter without looking at it and moved to the window that looked out over the courtyard. From this angle, I could see into David's apartment across the way. The lights were on, and I caught a glimpse of him moving around inside, setting the plant on what looked like a windowsill. For just a moment, I allowed myself to watch him, this stranger who was no longer quite a stranger, as he went about the business of settling into his evening. Then I caught myself and stepped back from the window, feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line. Whatever loneliness I was carrying, whatever strange attraction I'd felt toward this man I'd known for all of 10 minutes, it didn't give me the right to intrude on his privacy, even from a distance. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down in my single chair, but I found it impossible to concentrate on the book I'd been reading or the documentary I'd queued up on my laptop. My mind kept drifting back to the elevator, to the warmth of David's handshake, to the way he'd looked when he talked about his sister's plant. There had been something there, not just politeness or neighborly courtesy, but a genuine moment of connection that felt as rare and fragile as it was unexpected. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a pleasant encounter with a new neighbor, nothing more. But even as I formed the thought, I knew it wasn't quite true. There had been something in the way he'd looked at me, something in the cadence of our conversation that felt different from the usual social interactions I navigated with careful politeness and emotional distance. The evening stretched out before me, long and quiet as always, but somehow changed. For the first time in months, I found myself aware of the sounds from the apartment next door, not in an intrusive way, but with a kind of gentle curiosity. The soft thud of footsteps, the distant sound of running water, the faint murmur of what might have been music or television. Signs of life, of someone else navigating the small rituals of an evening alone. I went to bed earlier than usual, but sleep proved elusive. I lay in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling and replaying every moment of our encounter. The way David had said my name, the warmth in his voice when he thanked me for holding the elevator, the honest admission about finding comfort in knowing someone else was awake during the long, quiet hours of the night. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of elevators and hallways and conversations that went on longer than they should have, filled with the kind of easy intimacy that I'd almost forgotten was possible. I woke the next morning with an unusual sense of anticipation, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what I was anticipating. My routine was the same as always: coffee, shower, the mechanical process of preparing for another day at the office, but everything felt slightly different, touched with the possibility of something. As I was leaving for work, I found myself listening more carefully than usual to the sounds from the hallway. Was David getting ready for his day too? Did he have somewhere to go? Someone waiting for him? The questions felt too personal, too intrusive, but I couldn't seem to stop myself from wondering. The elevator arrived empty, and I rode down to the lobby alone, but the space felt charged with the memory of our conversation the night before. I found myself looking for him as I walked through the lobby, though I wasn't sure what I would say if I saw him. Good morning seemed too casual, too ordinary for the strange weight of what had passed between us. The day at work dragged by with unusual slowness. I found myself distracted, my mind wandering back to David's gentle eyes and the way he'd held that plant like it was something precious. I caught myself checking the clock more often than usual, mentally calculating how long until I could go home and maybe run into him again. It was foolish, this sudden preoccupation with a man I barely knew. I was 34 years old, long past the age of developing crushes on near strangers based on a single elevator ride. But there was something about David that had gotten under my skin, something that made me feel more awake and alive than I'd felt in months. The afternoon crawled by, filled with emails and conference calls and all the mundane business of my professional life, but underneath it all was a low thrum of anticipation. I was going home to a building where David lived, where I might see him again, where the possibility of another conversation hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. By 5:30, I was practically vibrating with restless energy. I wrapped up my work with unusual efficiency and made my way to the subway, joining the familiar crush of commuters heading home to their own lives, their own complicated webs of connection and isolation. The train was crowded, filled with the usual mix of tired office workers and students and people whose stories I would never know. I found myself studying their faces, wondering who among them was going home to someone who cared whether they arrived safely, who was looking forward to an empty apartment and the blessed relief of solitude, who was carrying the same strange mixture of hope and anxiety that seemed to have taken up residence in my chest. The building lobby looked exactly the same as always: polished floors, neutral walls, the persistent hum of fluorescent lighting, but it felt different somehow, charged with possibility. I checked my mailbox, though I'd picked up yesterday's mail just 12 hours earlier, and found nothing but a flyer for a pizza place I'd never tried. The elevator arrived, and as the doors opened, I felt a small jolt of disappointment. Empty. I pressed the button for the 7th floor and tried to ignore the way my heart was beating just a little too fast. This was ridiculous. I was acting like a teenager with a crush, not a grown man who had successfully navigated 34 years of life without losing his composure over a conversation with a neighbor. The hallway was quiet when I stepped out of the elevator, but I found myself walking more slowly than usual, listening for any sounds that might indicate David was home. Nothing. Just the usual ambient noise of a building full of people living their separate lives. I let myself into my apartment and went through my usual routine: mail on the counter, keys in the bowl by the door, jacket hung in the closet with military precision. But instead of settling into my evening ritual of solitude, I found myself drawn to the window that looked out over the courtyard. David's apartment was dark. I stood there for a moment, looking across at the empty windows, and felt something that might have been disappointment settle in my stomach. Of course he wasn't home yet. He probably had a job, maybe friends to meet for drinks, a social life that extended beyond the narrow confines of work and apartment that had become the borders of my own existence. I made dinner, pasta with olive oil and garlic, nothing fancy, and ate it standing at the counter while reading the news on my phone. But I found it hard to concentrate on the headlines when part of my attention was focused on the sounds from the hallway, listening for the familiar chime of the elevator, the soft footsteps that might indicate David's return. 8 o'clock came and went. Then 9. By 10, I'd given up any pretense of not listening for him and had settled into my chair with a book I wasn't really reading. The building around me hummed with its usual evening sounds, muffled conversations, television shows, the distant sound of someone running water, or opening and closing cabinets. At 10:30, I heard it, the soft chime of the elevator arriving on the 7th floor. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and slightly uneven, as if whoever it was carrying something heavy or awkward. Then the soft sound of a key turning in a lock, and the distinctive squeak of David's door opening and closing. He was home. I sat in my chair, holding my book but not reading it, acutely aware of his presence just on the other side of the wall. I could hear him moving around, the soft thud of what might have been shoes being removed, the sound of cabinets opening and closing in what I assumed was his kitchen, the low murmur of what might have been a television being turned on. It was strangely comforting, this awareness of someone else's domestic routine playing out in parallel to my own. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel quite so alone in my quiet apartment. There was someone else there, just a wall away, going through the same small rituals of settling into an evening at home. I found myself synchronizing my movements to his, as if we were engaged in some kind of silent dance. When I heard him moving around his kitchen, I got up to make myself a cup of tea. When the sounds from his apartment grew quiet, I settled back into my chair with my book. It was silly, this imaginary companionship, but it filled something in me that I hadn't realized was empty. Around 11, I heard his television turn off, and then the apartment next door grew quiet. I sat in my own silence for a while longer, reluctant to break the spell of this strange, distant intimacy. Finally, I closed my book and prepared for bed, going through my usual routine of checking the locks and turning off the lights. As I was brushing my teeth, I heard something that made me pause, the soft sound of footsteps from David's apartment, slow and measured, as if he was pacing. Then nothing for a long moment, followed by the footsteps again. He was walking around his apartment, unable to settle, maybe wrestling with his own sleeplessness. I finished brushing my teeth and made my way to my bedroom, but instead of getting into bed immediately, I found myself sitting on the edge of the mattress, listening to the quiet sounds from next door. The footsteps continued for another few minutes, then stopped. I heard what might have been a door opening and closing, then silence. I lay down and stared at the ceiling, thinking about David on the other side of the wall, maybe staring at his own ceiling, both of us alone, but somehow less alone than we'd been 24 hours earlier. The thought was oddly comforting, and for the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without having to fight the restless anxiety that usually plagued my nights. The next few days fell into a strange kind of rhythm. I found myself timing my departures for work to coincide with what I hoped might be David's schedule, though I never quite managed to encounter him in the elevator or hallway. But his presence in the building had become a constant, gentle awareness. I knew when he was home by the soft sounds from his apartment, knew when he was out by the silence that seemed to press against the wall between us. It was Thursday evening when I finally saw him again. I was coming home later than usual, having stayed at the office to finish a project that had been dragging on for weeks. The building lobby was dimly lit, most of the residents already settled in for the evening. I was checking my mailbox when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. "Michael?" I turned, and there was David, carrying what looked like takeout containers and wearing a slight smile that made something warm unfurl in my chest. "David," I said, closing my mailbox and trying to keep the pleasure out of my voice. "How are you settling in?" "Better, thanks. I took your recommendation about Luna's, by the way. You were right about the coffee." "You went to Luna's?" Something about this pleased me more than it should have. The idea that my casual recommendation had influenced his routine, that in some small way I'd helped him navigate this neighborhood that we both called home. Yesterday morning, actually. I was running late for work and I figured I'd grab a quick cup on the way. Ended up staying for almost an hour. We walked toward the elevator together and I found myself studying his profile as he pressed the call button. He looked tired, I thought, but it was a different kind of tiredness than what I'd seen on his face that first night. Less weighted down, maybe. More like simple fatigue at the end of a long day, rather than the bone-deep exhaustion of someone carrying too much. "Good day at work?" I asked as we stepped into the elevator. "Not bad. Still getting used to the new routine, but I think I'm finding my rhythm." He paused, then added, "What about you?" "You've been getting home later than usual this week." The observation caught me off guard. Had he been paying attention to my schedule the same way I'd been aware of his? The possibility sent a small thrill through me, followed immediately by a flutter of anxiety. What did it mean that we were both tracking each other's routines with this kind of careful attention? "Work's been busy," I said, which was true enough. "I've been staying late to catch up on some projects." "Well, don't work too hard," David said, and there was something in his voice, a note of genuine concern that seemed to go beyond polite conversation. We rode the rest of the way up in comfortable silence, but I was acutely aware of his presence beside me. He smelled like something clean and warm, maybe soap, maybe just the particular scent that belonged to him alone. It was oddly intimate, being able to identify his smell, as if I was collecting small pieces of information about him without his knowledge or consent. When we reached the 7th floor, we walked down the hallway together, falling into step without conscious thought. Our footsteps were muffled by the carpet, creating a soft rhythm that felt almost companionable. "David," I said as we approached our doors, "I don't suppose—" I trailed off, suddenly unsure of what I'd been about to say. "What?" I fumbled with my keys, trying to buy myself time to figure out how to finish the sentence I'd started without sounding desperate or strange. "I was just wondering if you'd had a chance to explore much of the neighborhood yet. Beyond Luna's, I mean." "Not really," he admitted. "I've been meaning to, but it's hard to know where to start when you don't really know anyone." There it was, the opening I'd been looking for without really knowing I was looking for it. "I could show you around sometime if you'd like. I've been living here for about 3 years, so I know the area pretty well." The offer hung between us in the hallway, and I held my breath while David considered it. His face was difficult to read in the harsh fluorescent light, but I thought I saw something shift in his expression. Interest, maybe, or surprise. "That's really kind of you," he said finally. "I'd like that." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a flutter of nervous anticipation. "Great. Maybe this weekend. Saturday afternoon, if you're free?" Saturday afternoon sounds perfect. We'd reached our respective doors, and I found myself reluctant to end the conversation, to retreat back into our separate spaces. There was something about these chance encounters in the hallway that felt precious, too fragile to be taken for granted. "It's a plan, then," I said, inserting my key into the lock. "It's a plan." I let myself into my apartment and closed the door behind me. But instead of the usual relief I felt upon arriving home, I was buzzing with a kind of restless energy. I had a plan with David. We were going to spend time together, explore the neighborhood, maybe have an actual conversation that lasted longer than the duration of an elevator ride. I realized I was smiling as I hung up my jacket and set my keys in the bowl by the door. When was the last time I'd looked forward to something social? When was the last time I'd made plans with another person that weren't work-related or obligatory? I couldn't remember. The evening passed in a haze of distracted activity. I tried to read, tried to watch television, tried to focus on the small domestic tasks that usually filled my solitary hours. But my mind kept drifting to Saturday afternoon, to the prospect of walking through the neighborhood with David, of showing him the small places that had become meaningful to me over the years of living alone in this city. What would we talk about? What did I really know about him, beyond the fact that he'd moved from somewhere else and worked somewhere that required him to stay late on Thursday evenings? What if we ran out of conversation after the first 10 minutes? What if the easy rapport we seemed to have in small doses didn't translate to a longer stretch of time together? But beneath the anxiety was something else. Anticipation. Pure and simple. The possibility of connection with someone who seemed to understand something about the particular weight of moving through the world alone. Friday passed with agonizing slowness. I found myself distracted at work, checking the clock every few minutes and calculating how many hours remained until Saturday afternoon. By the time I got home Friday evening, I was practically vibrating with nervous energy. I heard David come home around 8, and the familiar sounds of his evening routine felt different now, charged with the knowledge that tomorrow we would spend time together outside the confines of the building. I found myself wondering what he was doing, whether he was looking forward to our plans, or whether he was already regretting his agreement to them. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for walking around the neighborhood. I woke earlier than usual and spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear. Not too formal, not too casual, nothing that would suggest I was trying too hard, or that I thought this was anything more than two neighbors exploring the area together. I settled on jeans and a sweater, then changed into a button-down shirt, then back to the sweater. By the time I'd finally committed to an outfit, it was almost noon, and I realized I had no idea what time we were supposed to meet. We'd said Saturday afternoon, but we hadn't been more specific than that. I spent the next hour pacing around my apartment, alternately checking the clock and listening for sounds from David's place. At 1 o'clock, I heard his door open and close, followed by footsteps in the hallway. Was he leaving? Had I missed our appointment? Should I go after him? Before I could make a decision, there was a soft knock at my door. I opened it to find David standing in the hallway, looking slightly uncertain but smiling. He'd changed since yesterday. Instead of the work clothes I'd seen him in, he was wearing dark jeans and a gray sweater that brought out the color of his eyes. "I hope I'm not too early," he said. "I wasn't sure what time we were planning to head out." "No, not at all." Perfect timing, actually. I grabbed my jacket and keys, suddenly grateful that he'd taken the initiative to come to my door rather than leaving me to agonize over the timing. We made our way downstairs and out into the afternoon air. The neighborhood looked different somehow, seen through the lens of sharing it with someone else. The familiar streets and storefronts felt new again, worth paying attention to in a way they hadn't for months. "Where should we start?" David asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside our building. "Well, you've already discovered Luna's," I said. "What are you interested in? Food, books, just general wandering?" "General wandering sounds perfect. I like getting a feel for a place before I start looking for specific things." We started walking south, toward the small commercial district that had drawn me to this neighborhood in the first place. The afternoon was cool but sunny, and the sidewalks were busy with people running errands, walking dogs, enjoying the kind of lazy Saturday activity that I usually observed from a distance. "So," David said as we walked, "how long have you been in the city?" "About 8 years now. I moved here right after college, got a job at a small consulting firm." "You?" "3 weeks," he said with a laugh. "But I lived here briefly about 10 years ago, right after I finished grad school. I left after about a year, though. Went back home for a while, then moved around quite a bit before ending up back here." "What brought you back?" He was quiet for a moment, and I worried that I'd asked something too personal. But then he said, "I guess I finally figured out that running away from something doesn't actually make it go away. Sometimes you have to come back and face it properly." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, so I let the comment hang between us as we walked. But I filed it away, another small piece of the puzzle that was David's story. We passed Luna's. "There's your coffee place," I said, and he smiled, and continued south toward the small park that anchored this section of the neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a few benches and some trees, but it was a pocket of quiet in the urban landscape. "This is nice," David said as we entered the park. "I didn't know it was here." "It's easy to miss if you're just walking by. I discovered it by accident one day when I was trying to find a quiet place to make a phone call." We found an empty bench and sat down, watching the small drama of city life play out in front of us. A woman was throwing a tennis ball for an enthusiastic golden retriever. An elderly man was feeding pigeons from a small paper bag. Two teenagers were sitting on the grass, sharing earbuds and nodding along to whatever music they were listening to. "It's funny," David said after a moment. "I spent so many years thinking I needed to live somewhere big and exciting, somewhere with lots of opportunities and things happening all the time. But what I actually love are the small, quiet moments like this." "What changed?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him weighing how much to share. "I think I finally realized that I was confusing being busy with being happy. I was always looking for the next thing, the next place, the next opportunity to reinvent myself. But you can't run away from yourself forever." There was something achingly familiar about what he was describing. Not the moving around. I'd been living in the same city for years, but the sense of confusing motion with progress, of thinking that if you just kept busy enough, you could avoid having to face the deeper questions about what you actually wanted from life. "I know what you mean," I said. "I've been in the same place for years, but I think I've been running away too. Just in a different way." David turned to look at me, his expression curious but not pressing. "How so?" I'd never articulated this thought before, even to myself, but sitting in this small park with this man I barely knew, it felt safe to try. "I think I convinced myself that if I kept my life small and controlled enough, I wouldn't have to risk being disappointed. No big dreams, no messy relationships, no complicated emotions. Just work and home and the basic business of getting through each day." "And how's that working out for you?" I laughed, but it came out sounding slightly hollow. "About as well as you'd expect." "I'm safe, but I'm also—" I trailed off, searching for the right word. "Empty, I suppose. Like I'm living half a life." David nodded slowly. "I've been there. Different circumstances, but the same feeling. Like you're going through all the motions of being alive without actually feeling alive." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the life of the park continue around us. There was something profound about this moment. Two near strangers sharing truths they might never have admitted to people who knew them better. The anonymity of it somehow made it safer, less loaded with the weight of ongoing relationship and expectation. "Can I ask what you do for work?" David said eventually. "Data analysis for a consulting firm. It's about as exciting as it sounds." I turned to him. "What about you?" "I'm a therapist. Just started at a clinic downtown. Hence the late nights this week. I've been staying after hours to get through all the intake paperwork." That explained the gentle way he had of listening, the sense I had that he was really paying attention to what I was saying, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. It also made me slightly self-conscious about the revelations I'd just made. Was he analyzing me? Did he see something in my— The words hung in the air between us like something fragile and precious, threatening to shatter if either of us moved too quickly. Michael's voice had been so soft when he said it. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to," that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it. But there he was, standing in his doorway with rain-damp hair and eyes that held something I recognized but couldn't name. Something that made my chest tight with possibility and terror in equal measure. I should have said something. Should have nodded, or smiled, or done anything to acknowledge the invitation hanging between us. Instead, I stood there on his porch like an idiot, my jacket half-zipped, my keys heavy in my pocket, watching water drip from the gutters into the growing puddles below. The rain had picked up again while we'd been talking, turning from a gentle mist into something more insistent. The kind of rain that made you want to be inside, somewhere warm, with someone who understood the particular loneliness of Sunday nights in October. I started, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? That yes, I wanted to stay, but I didn't know what staying meant? That I'd been thinking about him for weeks, maybe months, in ways that scared me? That something about the careful way he'd tended to his garden, the gentle way he'd spoken about his late partner, had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest and refused to leave? Michael must have seen something in my face, uncertainty maybe, or hope disguised as hesitation, because he stepped back slightly, making room. "Come in," he said, and this time it wasn't really a question. "It's getting cold out there." I followed him inside, shaking the rain from my jacket and hanging it on the same hook by the door where it had lived earlier that afternoon. The familiarity of the gesture struck me as oddly intimate, as if I belonged here in some small way, as if this wasn't the second time I'd been in his house, but the 100th. The living room looked different in the evening light, warmer somehow, with the lamps casting golden circles on the walls and the sound of rain against the windows creating a cocoon around us. Michael moved toward the kitchen, then paused, turning back to me with that same uncertain expression he'd worn on the porch. "I could make tea," he offered. "Or coffee, if you prefer. I think I have some wine somewhere, though it's probably not very good. I don't usually—" "Tea sounds perfect," I said, cutting off his nervous rambling. Something about seeing him flustered made my own anxiety settle slightly. At least I wasn't the only one who didn't know what we were doing. He nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the steady drum of rain on the roof. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, where the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting wavering reflections in the puddles. My apartment was only a 10-minute walk away, but it felt impossibly distant now, like something from another life. I could hear Michael moving around in the kitchen, the whistle of the kettle, the clink of mugs, the soft slide of a drawer opening and closing. Domestic sounds that spoke of routine and solitude and the small rituals we create to fill our days. I wondered what his evenings usually looked like. Did he eat dinner at the small table by the window? Did he read on the couch until his eyes grew heavy? Did he ever sit in the garden after dark, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the life he'd built here? And the one he'd lost? "I hope chamomile is okay," he said, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "It's all I had that seemed appropriate for whatever this is." I accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping my hands around its warmth. "Whatever this is," I repeated, tasting the words. They were honest, at least. Neither of us knew what we were doing here. We settled on the couch, not quite touching, but close enough that I could smell his soap, something clean and understated that made me want to lean closer. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt expectant, like the pause before a symphony begins, when the musicians have their instruments ready but haven't yet played the first note. "I'm glad you stayed," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I admitted, though the words felt inadequate. Glad seemed too small a word for the way my pulse had quickened when he'd asked me not to leave, for the way something inside me had unclenched when I'd stepped back through his door. We sipped our tea in silence, the warm liquid loosening something in my chest that had been tight for longer than I cared to admit. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and I found myself thinking that this was exactly where I wanted to be. Not just tonight, but in general. Sitting beside someone who understood that silence could be as meaningful as conversation, that sometimes the most important things were the ones left unsaid. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said after a while, setting his mug on the coffee table with careful precision. "Of course." "Earlier, when you were talking about Austin, about Alex," he paused, searching for the right words. "You sounded like someone who'd been happy once. Really happy. And I was wondering, what happened? I mean, if you don't mind me asking." I stared down at my tea, watching the steam curl up from the surface. It was a fair question, and one I'd been avoiding answering, even to myself, for years. Life happened, I guess. The usual things. Work got busy, really busy, and Alex's cafe was struggling. We started seeing each other less, talking less. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled down, we'd get back to where we were. I took a breath, surprised by how much I wanted to tell him the truth. But that's not really what happened. The truth is, I got scared. We'd been together for almost 3 years, and Alex started talking about the future, about us moving in together, maybe even getting married. And instead of being excited, I panicked. I started finding excuses not to be around. Working late, traveling for conferences I didn't really need to attend. I convinced myself I was protecting us both, giving us space to figure things out. "But you were really protecting yourself," Michael said quietly. Yeah. The admission felt like swallowing glass. I was. Because somewhere along the way, I'd started to believe that if I let myself be that happy, something would inevitably take it away. And I thought if I pulled back first, if I controlled the distance, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much when it ended. But it ended anyway. It ended anyway. I set my mug down next to his, my hands suddenly shaky. Alex tried for months to figure out what he'd done wrong. He'd show up at my apartment with takeout from our favorite restaurant, or tickets to shows he thought I'd like. And I'd find reasons to be busy, to push him away a little more each time. Until finally, he stopped trying. The memory of that last night still made my stomach clench. Alex standing in my doorway, his face a careful mask of resignation, saying he was tired of fighting for something I clearly didn't want. I'd wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wanted it more than I'd ever wanted anything. Instead, I'd stood there and let him leave. I told myself it was for the best, I continued. That we were too different, that it never would have worked long-term anyway. But the truth is, I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was too scared to trust that it could last. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd said too much. Scared him off with my catalog of failures and self-sabotage. But when I looked up, his expression wasn't judgmental or uncomfortable. It was understanding, tinged with a sadness that seemed to encompass more than just my story. "I know something about being scared," he said finally, "about believing that good things are temporary by nature." "Yeah?" He nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "David and I were together for 15 years. 15 years, and I still used to lie awake at night sometimes, convinced that he'd wake up one morning and realize he could do better, that he'd leave me for someone younger or more successful or just more. But he didn't. No, he didn't. He died still loving me, still believing in us. And for a long time I thought that made me the lucky one, that I'd gotten the fairy tale ending, even if it was cut short." He paused, his voice growing softer. "But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I was just as scared as you were. If I spent so much time waiting for the other shoe to drop, that I missed some of what we had while we had it. I wanted to reach for him then, to offer some kind of comfort, but I didn't know if that was what he wanted. Didn't know what the rules were for this conversation, for this night, for whatever was happening between us." "Do you regret it?" I asked instead. "Being with him, knowing how it would end?" "Never." The word came out fierce, immediate. "I regret the time I wasted worrying about losing him. I regret the nights I stayed late at work when I could have been home with him. I regret not telling him I loved him more often because I was afraid of seeming needy or sentimental." He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd started talking about this. "But I will never regret loving him. Even knowing what I know now, I'd do it all again." Something shifted in my chest at his words, a loosening, like a knot I didn't know I'd been carrying had finally come undone. "I wish I could say the same." "Maybe you can," he said quietly. "Maybe it's not too late." "It is, though." Alex moved back to West Texas years ago, got married, has kids now. He's built a whole life that doesn't include me. I wasn't talking about Alex. The words hit me like a physical thing, sudden and breathtaking. I looked up to find Michael watching me with an intensity that made my skin feel too warm, too tight. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before, a kind of careful hope that made my heart stutter in my chest. "Michael," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence, didn't know how to bridge the gap between what I wanted to say and what I was brave enough to admit. "I know we barely know each other," he said, his voice steady despite the flush creeping up his neck. "I know this probably seems crazy or inappropriate or—" "It doesn't," I interrupted. "It doesn't seem crazy." The relief that crossed his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted, "since that first day when you helped me with the garden hose. I've been watching for you, hoping I'd see you outside so I'd have an excuse to talk to you." "I noticed," I said, and his flush deepened. I hoped that's what it was. But I wasn't sure if I was reading too much into it or if maybe you were just being neighborly." "I was being neighborly," he said with a small smile. "But not just neighborly." The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, no longer urgent but persistent, like it planned to continue all night. The sound created a sense of enclosure, as if the house had become a sanctuary separate from the rest of the world. Nothing existed beyond these walls, beyond this moment of fragile honesty. "I don't know how to do this," I confessed. "It's been so long since I let myself want something, someone, that I'm not sure I remember how." "Me neither," Michael admitted. "I loved David so completely for so long that I never imagined feeling this way about anyone else. And then you moved in next door, and you were kind to me and patient with my terrible small talk about gardening, and I started to think—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I started to think maybe there was room in my life for something new." The word hung between us. New. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely different. Something that could exist alongside the memory of past love without diminishing it. I set my mug aside and turned to face him more fully. He was so close I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threads in his hair that caught the lamplight. He was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth or conventional attractiveness, and everything to do with the kindness in his expression, the careful way he held himself, the gentle strength in his hands. "I'm scared," I said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied. "So am I." But he didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted slightly closer, close enough that our knees were almost touching, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "We could take it slow," he offered. "We could see what happens, without any expectations or promises." Just see. It was exactly what I needed to hear. Permission to want this without guarantees, to explore whatever was building between us without the pressure of defining it or predicting its outcome. For someone who'd spent years protecting himself from the possibility of loss, it felt revolutionary. "I'd like that," I said. Michael's smile was soft, relieved. "Good. I'd like that too." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling around us. I felt lighter somehow, as if admitting my fears had robbed them of some of their power. Michael looked more relaxed too, the tension in his shoulders easing as he leaned back into the couch cushions. "This is nice," he said after a while, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "Just sitting here. I'd forgotten how nice it could be having someone to sit with." "Yeah," I agreed, though nice felt inadequate to describe the warmth spreading through my chest. It was more than nice. It was necessary in a way I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Without thinking, I let my hand drift to rest on the couch cushion between us, palm up, an invitation without words, an offering of connection that he could accept or ignore as he chose. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt the whisper-light touch of his fingers against mine, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he traced the lines of my palm. The contact was electric, sending small shocks up my arm and straight to my chest. Such a simple touch, barely even that, but it felt monumental, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold that there was no going back from. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "More than okay," I managed, though my own voice sounded strange to my ears. His fingers intertwined with mine, careful and deliberate, and I marveled at how perfectly our hands fit together, at how right it felt to be touching him, even in this small way. I couldn't remember the last time I'd held someone's hand, really held it, not just a quick squeeze or a polite shake, and the intimacy of it was almost overwhelming. "I haven't done this in a long time," Michael said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "Done what?" "Held hands?" He nodded, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. Any of it, really. Sat close to someone, talked about feelings, let myself hope for something I wasn't sure I could have. "How does it feel?" I asked, genuinely curious. I was still learning how to identify my own emotions, let alone ask someone else about theirs. He considered the question seriously, his brow furrowing slightly. "Terrifying," he said finally. "But also alive. I feel alive in a way I haven't in years." I knew exactly what he meant. There was something awakening in my chest, something that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten it existed. It felt dangerous and necessary at the same time, like discovering you'd been holding your breath for years and finally being able to exhale. We sat like that for what felt like hours, hands entwined, watching the rain trail down the windows and listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling around us. The grandfather clock chimed 10, then 1/2 past, but neither of us made any move to acknowledge the lateness of the hour. Time seemed suspended, irrelevant. There was nowhere else I needed to be, nothing else I needed to do except sit here beside this man who'd somehow become essential to my well-being in the span of a single afternoon. "Tell me something," Michael said eventually. "Something you've never told anyone else." The request was unexpected, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical touch. I found myself thinking of all the secrets I'd accumulated over the years, small shames and private fears and moments of unexpected beauty that had never seemed worth sharing with anyone else. "I used to write," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "Poetry mostly? Terrible, self-indulgent stuff about loneliness and longing and all the things I was too afraid to say out loud. What happened to it? I threw it all away when I moved here. Told myself it was just taking up space, that I'd never be any good at it anyway." I paused, remembering the afternoon I'd spent feeding page after page into the shredder, destroying years of late-night scribblings and careful revisions. But really, I think I threw it away because it was too honest, too revealing. And I was tired of revealing myself to no one. Michael's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "Do you miss it? The writing?" "Every day," I admitted. "Sometimes I'll be walking to work or making coffee in the morning and I'll think of a line or an image that feels important. But then I tell myself there's no point in writing it down if no one will ever read it." "Maybe that's not the point," Michael said softly. "Maybe the point is just the writing itself, the act of putting words to things that feel too big for silence." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. "You sound like you know something about that." He was quiet for a moment, his thumb still tracing patterns on my skin. "David used to paint," he said finally. "Watercolors mostly. Landscapes and portraits and abstract pieces that made no sense to me but somehow captured exactly how I was feeling on any given day. He had a studio set up in the spare bedroom, and he'd spend hours in there, completely absorbed in whatever he was creating. Did he sell them? Exhibit them? No, never. He was too shy for that, too convinced they weren't good enough. But he painted anyway, almost every day, because he said it was how he made sense of the world, how he processed things that were too complex for words. I could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of past tense that turned every memory into an elegy. What happened to the paintings? They're still upstairs, he said quietly. I packed them away after he died because it hurt too much to look at them, but lately I've been thinking I should get them out again. Frame them, maybe. Put them where they can be seen. You should, I said, meaning it. He created them for a reason. They deserve to be witnessed. Maybe we both deserve to be witnessed, Michael said, and the words hit me with unexpected force. He was right, of course. We'd both been hiding, me behind my carefully constructed walls, him behind his grief and solitude. But sitting here with our hands intertwined and our defenses slowly crumbling, I was beginning to remember what it felt like to be seen. Really seen. Not just acknowledged or tolerated, but understood in some fundamental way. The clock chimed 11, and I realized with surprise that I had no desire to leave. My apartment felt increasingly abstract, like something from a dream I was forgetting upon waking. This couch, this man, this gentle exploration of possibility, this felt real in a way nothing had felt real in years. I should probably go soon, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Should you? Michael asked, and there was something in his voice that made me look up at him. His expression was soft but direct, hopeful without being pushy. Or do you just think you should? It was a fair question, and one that cut straight to the heart of my habitual self-protection. How many times had I left situations not because I wanted to, but because I thought I should? How many connections had I severed in the name of propriety or caution or simple fear? I don't want to go, I admitted, but I don't want to overstay my welcome either. I don't want to assume. You're not assuming anything, Michael interrupted gently. You're welcome here for as long as you want to stay. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever. The offer was simple and sincere, free of the complicated negotiations I'd come to expect from human connection. No games, no hidden meanings, just an honest invitation from someone who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. The couch is comfortable, he continued, and I could see the faint flush creeping up his neck again. I mean, if you wanted to stay. If the rain keeps up, or if you just don't feel like walking home. No pressure, just an option. I looked out at the window where the rain was still falling steadily and realized that the weather was the least relevant factor in my decision. I could walk home in a hurricane if I wanted to, but I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I wanted to stay exactly where I was. I'd like that, I said. If you're sure you don't mind. I don't mind, he said, and his smile was radiant. I'd love the company. He released my hand reluctantly and stood, smoothing down his shirt in a gesture that struck me as endearingly nervous. I'll get you some blankets. And a pillow. The couch pulls out into a bed, actually, if you'd be more comfortable that way. The couch is perfect, I said, and meant it. The idea of transforming this space into something explicitly designed for sleep felt too formal, too removed from the organic intimacy we'd been building all evening. I wanted to fall asleep here, in this spot where we'd been holding hands and sharing secrets, with the memory of his voice still echoing in the quiet air. While he gathered supplies from the linen closet, I wandered to the window and watched the rain continue its steady descent. The streetlights created small pools of illumination along the empty sidewalk, and I could see the faint glow of lights in windows up and down the block. Other people settling in for the night, other lives unfolding behind closed doors. But none of them felt as significant as this one, as charged with possibility and tender hope. Here we go, Michael said, returning with an armful of soft-looking blankets and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. He set them on the coffee table and stood back, suddenly uncertain again. I should let you get settled. It's late, and you probably want to stay, I said, the word coming out more forcefully than I'd intended. I mean, you don't have to go to bed yet, do you? We could talk a little more, if you want. Relief flickered across his features. I'd like that. I'm not really tired yet anyway. He settled back onto the couch, leaving space for me but close enough that I could still feel his warmth. I joined him, pulling one of the blankets over both of us in a gesture that felt natural and necessary. The fabric was soft against my skin, but not as soft as the brush of his arm against mine as we adjusted our positions. "This is nice," he said quietly, echoing his earlier words but with a deeper contentment now. I can't remember the last time I had someone to talk to at night. Someone who didn't mind just being here. I mind a lot of things, I said, settling into the warmth of the blanket and the gentle pressure of his shoulder against mine. But this isn't one of them. We fell into comfortable silence again, but it felt different now. Deeper, more settled. There was an intimacy to sharing a blanket that went beyond the simple practicality of staying warm. It created a small, enclosed world that belonged to just the two of us, separate from everything else that existed beyond these walls. I could feel myself relaxing in increments. Muscles I hadn't realized were tense, slowly unclenching as the evening's conversation and connection worked their way into my bones. Michael seemed to be experiencing something similar. The careful guardedness I'd noticed when we first sat down had given way to something more open, more trusting. "Can I ask you something else?" he said after a while. "Of course." "What do you think would have happened if we'd met earlier? I mean, if you'd moved in next door while David was still alive, or if I'd somehow ended up in Austin when you were with Alex?" It was an impossible question, and one that spoke to the particular cruelty of timing that seemed to govern so many human connections. I thought about it seriously, trying to imagine a version of events where our paths had crossed under different circumstances. "I don't know," I said finally. "I think maybe we wouldn't have been ready for each other. I was so closed off when I was with Alex, so determined to keep people at a safe distance. And you were happy with David, complete in a way that probably wouldn't have left room for whatever this is. You think we needed to be broken first?" "Not broken," I said, though the word wasn't entirely wrong. "But maybe we needed to understand loss. To know what it felt like to let something good slip away, so we'd recognize it when we found it again." Michael considered this, his breathing slow and even beside me. "That's a sad way to think about it. But not untrue." "No," he agreed. "Not untrue." I found myself thinking about all the near misses and almosts that had shaped both our lives, the chances not taken, the words not spoken, the connections severed by fear or circumstance or simple bad timing. It was easy to get lost in regret over those missed opportunities, to spend so much time mourning what hadn't happened that you missed what was happening right in front of you. But sitting here beside Michael, feeling the steady warmth of his presence and the careful way he was allowing space for whatever was building between us, I found myself grateful for the circuitous path that had led us to this moment. If we'd met earlier, we might have been different people, less patient, less careful, less aware of how precious it was to find someone who could sit with you in silence and make it feel like conversation. "I'm glad we met now," I said quietly. "I'm glad we're who we are now, and not who we were then." Michael turned to look at me, and in the soft lamplight, his expression was tender and wondering. Even though it took so long? Even though we both had to go through so much to get here? "Especially because of that," I said, and meant it completely. Something shifted in his face at my words. A softening, a release of tension I hadn't even noticed he was carrying. He shifted closer, close enough that I could feel his breath against my cheek, close enough that the space between us became charged with possibility. "I want to kiss you," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. The admission hung in the air between us, brave and vulnerable and utterly honest. My heart started beating faster, not from anxiety this time, but from want. Pure, uncomplicated want that I'd almost forgotten I was capable of feeling. "I want that too," I whispered back. He reached up slowly, giving me time to change my mind, to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of distance. But I didn't want distance anymore. I wanted this, the careful way he cupped my face in his hand, the gentle pressure of his thumb against my cheekbone, the tender intensity in his eyes as he searched my expression for any sign of uncertainty. When his lips finally met mine, it was soft and tentative and perfect. A question rather than a statement, an invitation rather than a demand. I answered by leaning into him, by letting my eyes flutter closed, by allowing myself to get lost in the simple miracle of connection after so many years of solitude. The kiss was everything a first kiss should be, sweet and nervous and full of promise. But it was also something more, something specific to us and this moment and the careful way we'd been circling each other all evening. It tasted like chamomile tea and possibility, like rain against windows and the particular bravery required to let someone see you as you really are. When we finally separated, it was only by inches. Michael rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed, his breathing slightly uneven. "That was," he started, then stopped, seeming to search for adequate words. "Yeah," I agreed, understanding perfectly. Some things were too significant for language, too complex for any description that wouldn't diminish them in the translation. We stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, letting the magnitude of what had just happened settle between us. I felt changed by the kiss, not dramatically, but fundamentally, like a piece of myself I'd been missing had suddenly clicked back into place. "We should probably get some sleep," Michael said eventually, though he made no move to pull away. "Probably," I agreed, equally reluctant to break the spell. But eventually, practical considerations asserted themselves. Michael reluctantly disentangled himself from our shared blanket and stood, immediately looking uncertain again, as if the kiss had been a dream he was already beginning to doubt. "If you need anything during the night," he said, "water or an extra blanket or—" "I'll be fine," I assured him, though the offer warmed me more than I could express. "Thank you. For everything. For letting me stay, for—" I gestured vaguely, unable to find words for the gift he'd given me tonight. "Thank you for staying," he replied simply. He headed toward the stairs, then paused at the bottom, turning back to look at me. "Good night," he said softly. "Good night, Michael." I watched him disappear up the stairs, then set about arranging the blankets and pillow into something resembling a bed. The couch was indeed comfortable, and the blankets carried the faint scent of fabric softener mixed with something uniquely Michael, clean and warm and indefinably comforting. As I settled into my makeshift bed, I could hear him moving around upstairs, the creak of floorboards, the soft sound of a door closing, water running in the bathroom. Domestic sounds that spoke of routine and solitude, but also, tonight, of the presence of another person in the house, someone who had chosen to let me stay, who had kissed me with such careful tenderness, who had somehow made me remember what it felt like to hope. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, no longer seeming like something to escape from, but something to be grateful for. If it hadn't started raining, I might never have knocked on his door. If I hadn't been soaked and slightly pathetic looking, he might not have invited me in. If we hadn't been trapped inside together by the weather, we might never have had the conversations that led to this moment of fragile, precious possibility. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and closed my eyes, but sleep felt distant and unnecessary. I was too wired, too full of the evening's revelations and connections to simply switch off consciousness. Instead, I lay there in the gentle darkness, replaying the conversations we'd had, the careful way he'd taken my hand, the soft press of his lips against mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not just geographically, but emotionally, spiritually, aligned with something larger than my own careful self-protection. It was a feeling I'd thought I'd lost forever, buried under years of disappointment and defensive solitude. But here it was again, fragile and tentative but unmistakably real. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that demanded guarantees and promises, but something quieter and more sustainable. The hope that maybe, just maybe, I had stumbled into something worth nurturing. Something worth the risk of being seen, of being vulnerable, of admitting that I needed more than I'd been allowing myself to want. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in the space between wakefulness and sleep, listening to the rain and the quiet sounds of the house settling around us. But eventually I heard footsteps on the stairs, soft, hesitant, pausing halfway down. "Are you awake?" Michael's voice came out of the darkness, barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, not bothering to pretend otherwise. I couldn't sleep either. He appeared at the edge of the living room, a dim silhouette in pajama pants and a t-shirt. "I kept thinking about tonight, about everything we talked about. About the kiss." "About the kiss," he confirmed, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good thoughts or worried thoughts?" "Good thoughts," he said quickly. "Definitely good thoughts. But also, I don't know how to do this. It's been so long since I felt this way about anyone, and I keep second-guessing myself, wondering if I'm moving too fast or not fast enough, or if I'm completely misreading the situation." I shifted over on the couch, making room. "Come here," I said softly. He hesitated for only a moment before crossing the room and settling beside me on the narrow couch. The space was barely big enough for both of us, which meant we had to lie close together, his arm beneath my head, my hand resting on his chest. It should have felt awkward or presumptuous, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Better?" I asked. "Much better," he breathed, and I could feel some of the tension leaving his body as he relaxed against me. We lay there in the darkness, listening to each other breathe and to the rain still falling outside. His heartbeat was steady beneath my palm, and I found myself matching my breathing to his, letting the rhythm of it anchor me in the present moment. "I don't know how to do this either," I admitted quietly. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together." "I'd like that," he said.